All right. I think we can get started now. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Here's our agenda for today. We'll start with Mayor Linder's workshop, and then we'll have a few minutes for a Q&A. And then afterwards, we'll have a debrief just with DCLC staff. So Mayor Linder comes to us with an educator's background and a wealth of experience in the fields of sociology, diversity training, and career counseling, among many others. He is a professor at Delaware County Community College. Professor Linder also served as a Chester City Council member and as the mayor of Chester from 2012 to 2016. Since 2017, Professor Linder has been a DCLC board member. So welcome, Mayor.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, if that means let's get started. First of all, I'm happy for DCLC to have me here to do this workshop, and I appreciate the work that they do in our community and have done over the years. I've got a rich history with DCLC besides previous to being a board member. So I appreciate what they do and what you guys do, the work that you have to do. You have a big task, and I hope that what I do helps with that task. So we don't have that much time, so I'm going to just get right into it. And I know there's going to be a question and answer period. And I also want to just put this in. I've been speaking with Dwayne. I know he has some issues at home, personal issues with his mother. So I want to keep him in our prayers and as we move through this exercise. So I've had most of the dialogue with him, and I appreciate the things that he's doing there with you guys. So we're in a very turbulent time, and everyone wants to know what to do and how to do it to help mitigate some of the things that are going on now. And during this workshop, I either dreamed about this or it just seems that I've been here before at this particular point in my life. As Robert pointed out, my background is in education, but I have a PhD in dealing with racism. I've been Black over 70 years. And when I say I have a PhD in racism, it's been piled very high and very deep. So I got some deep roots in handling this issue. I'm not the expert, but I've tried to bring things together and present them in a way so that you can appreciate a vision, an image, a perspective that will help you deal with some of the things now. So I wanted to start with our discussion next, Robert, next slide. Something happened to precipitate this. Something in history happened. And as a social scientist, I've had a chance to look at how people behave, why they behave that way for a number of years, including my own behavior, including the things that influence us to do one thing or do another, the kinds of things that facilitate our feelings, our thinking, and our behaviors. So at some point, an experiment went into motion, and people coming together, and people decided that they were going to be superior, and other groups other than them were going to be inferior. And this thinking didn't just start with slavery in the United States. I've got some things that I will send you after this so you can look at some of the periods in time that facilitated this kind of thinking. But this conditioned inferiority, if you want to see what the seeds are for this civil unrest, you can look at this condition. When you condition someone to be superior over a minority group or someone, and to condition that other person to be inferior, you set the seeds for this cycle of social failure. then frustration sets in. But you still have a chance. If you look at people, observe people, empathize with people, you'll notice a change in people when things are happening and that they need attending to. And so that first stage, frustration, is a stage where we start getting symptoms of people who are not pleased with the situation, rightly or wrongly. When we get the symptoms, sometimes it's a feeling, sometimes it's a look, it's an emotion, it's a quick behavior. If we don't intervene, we go to the next stage, and the next stage is aggression. So while frustration may be more covert, aggression is more overt. So people's voices start to get loud. Their movements become more exaggerated. They start to complain more often. And they're letting the establishment, they're letting the people know that are in charge, we are fed up, we're tired of this situation. And I'll go through the model, and there's other applications for this, but you'll see how this unfolds. So the institution, the government, the authority figures have been warned. They had at least 2 warnings: signs of frustration, excuse me, signs of aggression. And so what do? The next slide shows inaction. Somehow we ignore it. We act like it's not there. We act as if those people who are expressing those concerns don't count. And when we ignore it, we go to this next stage. And the next stage is explosion. And explosion can come in a number of different ways. As I told you, my background's in social sciences, so I've been a counselor, I've supervised therapists. We talk about the explosion. The explosion can be an implosion or an explosion. Whether it's self-destruct or other destruct, we're going to see some very exaggerated signs of people's aggression and unhappiness with that situation. And so what do? Then when we go to this next stage, we repress those signals. We repress the explosion. We put the people down. We put that particular movement down. And then it takes us back to the first step, where you show that we're in charge. We run this show. Yeah, you got complaints, but they don't count. And you then put the cycle of social failure back into motion. So I'll tell you the end game real quick. If you don't want to have the cycle of social failure, you got to flip the script on the behaviors. Somewhere along the line, you got to intervene into this cycle. So where did this cycle come from? Next slide. This has happened before. And Robert, I missed sending you a slide that I have that it says 50 years later, we did not listen. So that's what the caption says. But this Kerner Commission report was done. I know you noticed the date, and many of you are familiar with this, National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, and it was implemented in 1968. Next slide. It was implemented because there was a same kind of climate throughout the 50s and 60s that we see now. And it didn't stop there. We had it again in the 90s. So every 20, 30 years or so, when people get frustrated, we're going to see this thing happen. So if we don't do anything. So the Civil Rights Movement, yeah, we got the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Act, but people were still frustrated. You don't hear us. We still don't have the rights that we should enjoy as being here in America. Next slide. And so what happens? The next stage after frustration is aggression. So the Black Power movements emerged, the Black Panthers and some other groups, Student Nonviolent. It was a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but people saw them as being really violent because they were aggressive, highly aggressive. So people became more aggressive. Still wasn't recognized in the way that Black people thought that the country should be recognizing them. And so let's go to the next slide. 1964, police shootings in New York kicked off an array of riots. Now we got the explosion relative to the cycle of social failure. Next slide. 1965 Watts riot, explosion again. It's like fireworks going off. And you're hearing it all over the country during that time. I graduated from high school in 1965, and we were gravitating to the riots. The riots were a thing, not saying that we wanted to burn our neighborhoods down, but that was an expression of what was really going on in the Black community and with Black people in America. Next slide. 1967, riots in over 22 cities or 25 cities, total 150 uprisings. What kind of clearer message can you get that something is wrong? Something is definitely wrong. And it ain't just those people who are setting things on fire. Something's definitely wrong with that. I'll address that at the end. But again, this tells the establishment, the people in power, something is definitely wrong. So, next slide. President Johnson then says, hey, we're going to call in the troops. It's time for law and order. We're going to get a hold of this thing. You can't do this kind of thing. We're not going to accept it. And in many cases, rightfully so. But again, we're at the stage in our cycle. This is the repression we're talking about. And those of you who don't get the idea, let's say the United States was a person, and that person had a headache. And the headache was telling them that something is very, very wrong in your system. And so said, well, instead of me looking to see what's wrong, I'm going to repress that headache and I'm going to take an Advil. I'm going to take something to get rid of the headache. And that gets rid of the symptom, but not the problem. So that's what repression is in this case. Next slide. So President Johnson said that, okay, I want to know three things. We're going to put this commission into fold. It seems like I skipped a slide or something, but I'll go with this one. But he wanted to know three things. What happened? Well, I know what I wanted to say was, just remember, he sent the troops in, and that's a whole nother piece, but he sent them in to quiet the rioting, to quiet the communities, to regain civil order, because that's what his thing. He was a law and order president, and he's going to get a hold of the situation. So three questions. He wanted to know what happened, why did it happen, and how can we prevent it from happening again? Great questions. Fantastic. Next slide. Here's what his mandates were. He told them, he said, let your search be free. You guys go in there, I want the best. And remember, this is a predominantly white council that he put together, commission, led by Senator Otto Kerner from Illinois, and said, you guys be free. I want to know what's going on. Let it be untampered by conventional wisdom. Now, we can deal with that later, but what was conventional wisdom at that time? And here we go. I want you to find the truth, the whole truth in your report. So I guess that means share the whole truth. Tell us what the truth is. Next slide. Here's the report. Mr. President, the report tells us that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. We heard that before? I mean, it sounds like right now that they're saying this, and this is the same report. Next. This is what the report, he wants the truth, the whole truth. Mr. President, we found that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. That's what the urban, I grew up in the ghetto, but when I went to Widener University, I came from the community, okay? So white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White society created it, white society maintains it, and white society condones it. Now that right there is a pretty bitter pill, and I understand that. We can talk about that. That's why I'm going to pell-mell to the end of this, and we can discuss some of this. But this is the truth. Next slide. Excuse me. They said blacks are being systematically shut out of the opportunity to live the American dream. What have we been hearing? There's been one word we've been hearing over and over and over and over and over again, and that word is systematically. What is systematic racism? What is this thing systematically? So that means we have to do some systems work that either has never been done, or we have to redo some system work, or add some systems that work to help mitigate this problem. Next. They said they were projecting down the line that cities will have black majority by 1985, and most whites will be in the suburbs. And here you can get a sense of the anxiety that's been involved over the years of black people and brown people being compacted in the cities and white people being sort of separated and gradually moving to the periphery of the cities. Even our police officers, most of our administrators, were it not for a mandate in many cases that required politicians, mayors, council people to live in the city that they represent, you would have even more of it. But there's a mandate for that. So this is what the report said. This is what they told President Johnson. Next slide. They said programs need to be created now. I can't, let me just do something here for a second. They said programs need to be created now. If not, there would be continued polarization in the American society and ultimately the destruction of the basic democratic values. Now, I know you probably, it might be I have a different TV, but I know you probably heard this as well, that there's going to be destruction of our democratic values if we don't get a hold of this law and order thing. And a president has been saying this. So on my TV, I don't know whether I got a different station or not, but this sounds like the same thing that's been echoed over the last couple of years. And now we're culminating to a point where we want to blame someone for the erosion or potential erosion of these democratic values. And I'm just saying to you, we can talk about it in the question and answer period. Who do you think most of society outside the black community, who do you think they blame for the erosion or potential erosion of these democratic values? Again, our society is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. They told President Johnson this. He told him, tell me the truth. Again, we have in the report, the programs need to be constructed now, right now, or you'd have this continued polarization, separation, the ultimate destruction of democratic values. Who do you think people are blaming for the destruction of those democratic values? Okay, next. So, what did President Johnson do after those mandates? He ignored it. He ignored it. So here we have an example, a perfect example of the inaction stage. And where are we now? We're dealing with the residual effects 50 years later of this same information we knew 50 years prior. We knew it 50 years prior to that. So again, we don't have time to go into all of those other things that show us, that document that we could have done something about this a long time. And I'm saying we, as I'm an American, born in America, born, raised here in America, homegrown. We actually use that term. I'm homegrown American boy. But there's been issues for me as well as other people of color who've been the victims of this ignored behavior. You know, this is how impactful and important it is. Most of you are aware, because you work in the human services field, that if you have children, your own biological children, and you ignore the care for your children, it's a crime, isn't it? You have to account for that. And just so you know, the orphans court, that's why it's the orphans court. They'll step in and take your children, give them to children youth services until you get your act together, because you can't care for them anymore. Well, we've ignored our children, and we have to account for that some kind of way. Regardless of whether the kid's acting out or not, we have to do something about the conditions that really support that. Next. So I just thought I'd give a couple of definitions from a social psychological perspective. And I like to use a term called operational. And when I say operational, I try to give definitions that we can define and measure at some point. Because truthfully, and I should have said this at the outset, anti-racism, we want to be anti-racist. And I assume that everybody here who's listening to this wants some information on how to look at this thing and get the best, take the best courses of action to help mitigate some of this. We all want to be better in some way. So we have to look at some realities and look at some truths and be ready to confront them. And not so much know that we're going to win the game as much as we're going to grow in our capacity to be able to confront these issues one-on-one, as individuals and group to group, between groups. So racism is a system. We've heard that word. It's institutionalized and it's structured. I'm just going to move it's institutionalized and it's structured. There are long-standing beliefs, long-standing. As I said, this thing went into motion not just when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. I was saying that poem when I was a kid. I didn't know what Columbus did in 1492 except sail the ocean blue, and he discovered America. That's what I knew. I didn't know who he had on his ships, and I didn't know what he was bringing to America. But these long-standing attitudes and beliefs and behaviors, and they were practiced so long by those in power, and they still are practiced, and their intent can be overt or covert. I'm sorry, their behavior can be overt or covert, and racism can be intentional and unintentional. Because after you practice something so long, you know, it becomes part of your response repertoire, and then you don't know you're doing it. I'll give you an example of one, and I know some people don't like hearing this because they may have done it and not intended to offend anyone, but they wanted to say something. When I tell you, and I say to you, say, hey, you know, and you're a person of color, and I say to you, hey, I don't see color. So yeah, I'm not a person of color, but I say, John, I don't see color. I just see good and bad people. Well, and I'm not saying this to you if you said that. If you're a white person that have said that, or a black person said that, I don't want to say this to you, but you may have been unintentionally lying, but you were lying. You know, we do see color. How many of you like chocolate ice cream? Okay, you can do a thumbs up. I don't know how you do it over there. Yeah, some people, my class, they do thumbs, you know. They thumbs up, Professor Linder. I said, okay, well, let's roll with it, baby. All right. So how many of you like chocolate? We like chocolate ice cream. How many like vanilla ice cream? Some like vanilla. How many like the green ice cream? Mint chocolate chip. We see the color. Some of us like a blue car. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm gonna get to that. But I'm just saying that racism in its form can be overt or covert. Our behavior can be exaggerated. It can be subtle. Our intent intellectually can be intentional. I meant to do it, or unintentional. I did not mean to do it. Next slide. You guys got to forgive me. I'm a professor. I do elaborate. I try not to get stuck because I want to push towards getting. I learned about something because I know one of the things that happened, and when I started working with Black history and teaching at the college level, and people calling me in to do things, they said, well, how do you know that? Who said that? And I would say, John Karanga. They say, yeah, Black militant. I'd say, Malcolm, they're Black militant. I'd say this and say that. They are saying that because they want to have a vehicle to complain about some things, so they're making information up. So this information is in every history book, and it's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Everybody, see, I'm an old guy, so some of you might not even know what is the Encyclopedia Britannica, but that's where a lot of our information is compiled about history and so forth. So I learned about this paper bull. It's basically a doctrine. And back in 1452, 1455, there was a declaration of enslavement specifically pointed to sub-Saharan African people. Now, people will say, well, Black people weren't the only ones enslaved. I know, but this systematic thing went into effect where it was specifically pointed that they were going to use. In fact, I can't remember exactly who it was, but someone gave the popes and those guys 100 Black slaves. That's how this kicked off. And they said, you can take these slaves, and we can use slaves to go over and settle the Americas. We can send people around to do that. But here's the free slave labor. So that's how this all kicked off. This was a declaration with the Pope, and you get Nicholas 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And those guys all had the same name. They just had a different number. But this guy was Nicholas 5. So that's where that attitude comes from. So it's long standing, and we're all part of that European movement. And some of us don't want to connect with it, but I'm just saying that set the groundwork in motion for this kind of thinking to go around the world. Next. And then that was 1452. Then here we got Chris Columbus sailed the ocean 1492. So 50 years after Chris Columbus. So he went around the world with this thinking. And then when he got to the Americas, there was some other discussion, but it basically gave them the right to take over a land or take over a country and do what they wanted to do with the indigenous people. That's the language that was used in this. If those people are not like us, and I'm specifically leaving out some of the language, but here's the situation. If those people in those lands, the indigenous people of those lands are not like us, then you have our permission, the king, the queen, the pope, those in charge, the power establishment said that you have the right to either make them like us, or you have the right to kill them or enslave them. That was the thinking. Next. No. So I just wanted to put this in here. Again, I want to stimulate your thinking. And the United States is a doctrine. The United States Constitution, it's a doctrine. It's what we go by in this culture, what America is based on. Now, and when I say that, you may think I'm saying it's a bad doctrine, because you just gave us two doctrines, Professor, And here's what do you say about the Constitution? I'm saying they're words, they're long-standing words, they're attitudes, they describe a situation, and they give us the freedom to interpret those words and an expectation of what those words mean. Every last one of us who are here as American, as in fact, if you're not American, it tells you what America is and should be about. Just remember that. That's a doctrine. And that helps to facilitate an attitude. And we have to deal with those attitudes if we're going to be anti-racist and anti all these other things. Okay, next. Okay, so again, we dealt with racism. Prejudice is an attitude or feeling towards or away from a person, place, or thing. So again, I just laid out that example. We can be prejudiced about something. We can choose. We like this or we don't like that, and you're allowed to do that. That's fine, no problem with that. Next. Now, discrimination is a behavior that I engage in when I choose between two or more things. I select something out. I separate those things. When I asked my students, I said, why sometimes, well, now everybody's virtual, but in the class, I said, you know, why do you choose to sit in the front of the class or why do you choose to sit in the back of the class? Or because I'm a Black professor, I love to do that because they, oh no, not you. I just sit back here because I just want to be cool. I said, no, you did it. Once you saw I was Black, you sit in the back, you know, and we have a good laugh about it. And you know why? Because I want them to laugh and understand we can laugh at ourselves. We can look at our behavior. No, they didn't sit in the back because I was Black. They sit in the back because most students who sit in the back don't want to be bothered with the professor or anybody else, so they want to sit back there and be cool. You know, I'm basically the only one that can see what they're doing back there. So to get them involved, that's my little stimulus to help them see that we're going to have a good time in this class. So when we discriminate, all of us discriminate, white, Black, yellow, male, female, we discriminate. We choose between two or more things. It's when we put those two behaviors together along with certain thinking and we point to a group of people and we do that because of who they are or what they look like. That's the racism. And when we're in power to do it, we do it. You've heard some terms about Black people can't be racist, only white people, and a lot of people have a problem with that. But if you look at the operational definitions of racism, included in that operational definition of racism is power, the power to do so. So we can create a doctrine, so to speak, even if that doctrine is written or unwritten. We can create doctrines. I used to supervise police officers. Police have certain doctrines that they create about certain arrests that they're going to make when they're going to make. And in certain cases, I had to intervene. I said, hey, you can't do this that way. I want you to do your job, but I don't want you to do that. Okay, so I'll tell you about that later on if we have time. Okay, next. Okay. There's a man named Claude Steele. This is old research, but I'm gonna tell you, I point to Steele's research for a specific reason. And Claude Steele said that there's something called a stereotype threat. But what is a stereotype? It's a generalization about some aspect or dimension or character in the form of a physical, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual characteristic of an individual or a group. And apply it to all or most members of that culture. Now, I can't hear you, so you can answer the question or write it down, but I can't hear you, but just go with the question and you answer the question. I see 4 or 5 young Black men appearing to be about 14, 15, 16 years old, walking down the street. they seem to be, from my car, pretty tall, 6 feet, 6'2", 6 feet. There's one that's really tall. They have Nike sneakers on, and they got hoodies on that have Nike or some other kind of emblem on there, but they got the jogging suits that have all the stuff on. What sport do they play? Probably what? Basketball. It's a signature thing. So we tend to generalize one characteristic and apply it to all members of that group. I had a supervisor when I was in Northern Virginia at Northern Virginia Community College. He was about 6'8" or 6'9", black man. And when he would meet people, he'd meet them, my name is Dr. Washington and so forth, and he would shake their hand, and some people would be staring at him, looking up at him, and he would say, "No, I don't play basketball. I never did, and I don't like playing basketball, and I don't like it when you ask me." He would say that at the beginning of whoever he met. I said, "Craig, aren't you afraid you're going to really turn somebody off?" He said, "I don't care. I don't want people generalizing and thinking that I'm a basketball player." I said, "Man, okay, I got you, buddy." So we generalize. And is that by accident or by design? Many times it's by accident. We think that, hey, that guy probably plays sports. The other thing is, where are they? They're walking down the streets of Chester. Chester's DNA is basketball. I don't know how we got a soccer stadium in a basketball town, but again, there you go. We can talk about that later. As a politician, I can talk to you about that. But it's not a bad thing. I'm just saying, what a contrast, all right? Okay, next, we're just about coming down the stretch, I think, and I'm trying to make sure we have some time to talk. So this is another thing. This is a perception. I guess you wonder why this was tagged on, but remember we said racism comes from long-standing institutions and opportunities of empowerment, and it produces something. So back in the 60s, coming through the 70s, the social scientists and educators were looking at, well, why do people live in cultures of poverty? And some of the theorists, like Daniel Moynihan and some others, they said, well, you know, this culture of poverty produces after its own. Because the people are poor in their thinking, they continue to produce this culture of poverty, and they keep themselves in poverty because they don't know what to do. But the Kerner Commission Report said it's these institutions of racism that produces or are responsible for the culture of poverty, and here's why. Remember, there's a little word called power, and the Kerner Commission Report found out that there was systematic screening out of Black and brown people to move away from those areas of poverty and restrict them to certain locale, restrict them in the job market. In fact, they said there was institutional racism just about every major institution in our society, in housing, in banking, in religion, in education, economics, law, everything. They found out a lot. So go back and read it now with a different eye. Some of you've read it before or read portions of it before. Read it now with a different eye. But they said that the institutions who engage in this racism are majorly responsible for this culture of poverty, not the culture versus the culture itself being responsible. Yes, it's true. Poor parents tend to have poor children, and uneducated parents tend to have uneducated children. My mother, listen to the language. My mother went to the 8th grade. My mother went to the 8th grade. And the fact that when my mother went to the 8th grade, there was no Black high school, and there wasn't anyone in Chester, that's for sure. And she come from Danville, Virginia. My father went to the 4th grade. So both of them together possibly did not have a full 12 years of education, even though both of them went to school. And they were literate. My mother was very literate, excellent penmanship. Her penmanship was as beautiful as she was. If I had a picture to show you my mother, then you say, ah, that's a beautiful lady. But her penmanship, and that's what she focused on us, write well. And, you know, she wouldn't be too proud of some of the things I scribble now, but, you know, that's what she, so with opportunity, it contradicts the fact that the people did. If you go to the next slide, it's just the other opinion, I think. Yeah, Daniel Moynihan, in his book a couple of years earlier, before the Moynihan Report, reflected the prevailing attitudes at the time by politicians and social scientists and the status quo. It's the culture of the people producing the culture of poverty. And yeah, without any interventions, that's going to continue to happen. Back up for a minute, go back to the other one, Robert. So I just want you to kind of absorb this and get this idea. And your questions are centered around, I'm just putting the questions I've heard together. What can we do about this stuff? Well, there's some points of impact. And let me say this so you guys don't get frustrated and disillusioned with where you are. The Literacy Council, you're doing something about it. Right now, you're doing something about it. Many times people don't have time for this. and as a result, they don't have time for this, but we have time to place the blame. And so if we're going to place the blame, we got to have time to find out what the source of the problem is. Okay, the next slide. I think we're just about finished, aren't we? Next. Okay, so the Kerner Commission Report, again, said structured and institutional racism. It locks out BIPOC. You know who BIPOCs are. So it locks out BIPOCs out of opportunity, and it equals a culture. So no, I'm not going to tease you. I was going to tease you and keep on going and wasn't going to say, everybody knows what BIPOC is, Black, Indigenous People of Color. Remember that word, indigenous? It was in the 1452 doctrine. You can go in there and get those indigenous people and do what you want with them if they're not like us. And so this structured institutional racism locks out Black, Indigenous people of color out of opportunity. It's structured. And again, some of the behavior can be, the racism is intentional, but some of the attitudes developed later can be unintentional, intentional, overt versus covert. Is this the last one, Robert? Next.
Yeah, this is the last slide.
This is the last slide. Okay, and let me say this, and then we can talk about it. I sent another kind of a summary of a resume. I never get around to reducing it down to a half a page, but some of the things that I've been fortunate enough to be part of are a couple of a few books that I either co-authored or was a contributing author to. Oh, there's the rest of the people. Hello, everyone. And one of them is called The New 3 R's. And in The New 3 R's, The New 3 R's teaches us how to relate, represent, and reason with information that we're getting from people as we encounter people, whether we're teachers, counselors, psychologists, tutors, mentors. Our goal is to really hear people where they are. Now, I tell people this, I share this with my colleagues at the college. First of all, as you do your job with people of color, the first priority is to do your job. If your job is to teach them how to read, teach them how to read. The work comes in not biasing or being biased as you're doing that and being assumptive as you're doing that. The work comes in learning to suspend your judgments when you encounter issues that seem to be impediments to getting that person to where you need to get them. You don't need to be an expert in racism. You don't have to go back and undo all of these doctrines. What you have to do is you have to do the best that you can do right now in your craft to give this person the skills and skill sets from an unbiased perspective. And then when they have problems, to appreciate them in the moment as a human being encountering problems. And so then you're going to need to have some other stuff with you. And one of the things that I've been able to teach over the years and teach it from an operational standpoint, I used to teach counselors, I was a counselor, is empathy. And one of the books that Dr. Karkov wrote, and I helped to co-author the workbook, The Art of Helping. The core conditions that we need in order for us to be more effective. It's not going to make you an expert in racism, which you don't have to be. You have to be an expert in your chosen professional field and in the human encounter. I have to appreciate you as you are. That's why I'm glad I can see everybody now on the screen. So I'm not used to talking to people that I can't see, because seeing you is a big, big part of appreciating you in the moment. I want to be right there with you. And now that I got eye contact with you, you see how I get more animated when I see people. It's like, hey, people, and I just love it. So I think I'm going to stop because I know you guys may have some questions. And a friend of mine, he passed away, God bless him. But I told someone I'm going to talk about him every time I talk to people about literacy, because Dr. George Loganell was my friend and mentor and colleague down in Alexandria, Virginia. And he and I co-authored this book called Getting Away Clean, teaching kids how to handle negative peer pressure. And George used to talk. He had jokes, man. He'd have people laughing and all. And then he'd say, okay, now I'm gonna stop talking now, because if I keep talking, I'm gonna start lying. So he told me, John, I said, don't talk too long before you start lying. So I'm gonna stop, and you can ask questions if you need to or want to, or clarification. Wow. Stumped the panel.
Listen.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Am I the only one? Oh, go ahead. No, Robert, let's go.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes for Q&A. Marisa, would you like to start us off?
Of course, I always have questions. As I'm watching this, I'm thinking back to my education, when I was in high school and learning, and this to me seems essential to for everyone to know, but especially our children, our youth, our schools. Do you know anything about, I know where I live, there's hired an equity administrator and everyone's talking anti-racism curriculum. Is this something that we're talking about when we say that? Because it needs to be.
Again, like many other things, again, the caption for that newspaper says it all. Said 50 years ago, we knew it and nobody listened.
Right.
So and again, remember in racism, institutional racism, one key word is power. So if I control the curriculum and that's uncomfortable for me, then we don't need to go there, talk about that stuff, get everybody upset.
Right.
Sometimes it's unintentional. It's that, hey, we got a 50-minute time to deliver our curriculum. Teachers are concerned about getting the curriculum in, not about, and I'm coming from, been an educator over 30 years, and I understand it, I get it, because the administration says, here's what I'm paying you for, and you've got to be here by the end of the first semester or the first quarter. You gotta at least have talked about that content. And so if those kids don't get that content when you're talking about, drag them to the finish line. But make sure you got there, because when I go do your evaluation, I'm going to see how well you delivered what I asked you to deliver. But to answer your question, this should be an integral part of it. That's why I said, if you're going to be involved in this quote unquote anti-racist And you should be. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying, just get the idea. Everybody hasn't heard what you heard in the way you heard it. You heard it from a kid here that shouldn't be here. Just systematically, all those things lined up. First color here, tall black man from the hood. There's a couple of times, you know, police drove up on me. I shouldn't be here. Today's climate, I would have been dead. It just so happened that the community was a little bit more together in terms of knowledge of who lived in the community. But other than that, a couple of times, I'm not just saying one. This wasn't easy. I put this on. I could have been. I got some other church. I was going to be real cool this morning. I said, "No, I'm gonna look like a professor this morning." But see, that comes from my teaching and learning about who I am in the moment. So yeah, we should be teaching this, but I don't want you teaching this until you're equipped with to learn how to handle the kind of responses and reactions you're going to get back. So you can share it and share it earnestly and point to it. That's why I point. This is the stuff I just told you. It's not any magic stuff. It's in our history. Okay. Yes. Amy,
Well, Amy, we can't hear you.
you're unmuted. She's muted. I can't hear her.
Still. Would you like to type your question in the chat, Amy?
If she clicks on unmute, excuse me. While she's clicking, again, so you all are here, I'd be happy to do some workshops on one relating. In relating, we have when I see the question pop up, then, oh, okay. Oh no, that's Stephen. I thought that was a question. But I'd be happy to do some, I still can't hear her. Does she know she's on mute? Can she push a button? Can you push the mute?
Even when she was off mute, you couldn't hear her. So she did that with her speaker.
Oh man, I'm so sorry. You can call me back anytime and I'll answer your question. But I'd be happy to. If you send it to me, her question, I'll answer it, okay?
She said that she wanted to thank you for the very important information. And then Amy is typing in her question right now.
Yeah, while she's typing in the question, again, there's a continuum. This comes from social psychology. Feelings, behaviors, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors is a continuum. The way I think can control my behavior or influence my behavior, which can influence my feeling. Or it can be reversed. It's a reciprocal relationship between those three. The way I feel in the beginning of the day, man, I don't feel like this crap. You know, you can deal with this racism stuff, man, in the morning, early in the morning. So now my attitude is influencing my behavior. So I'm lethargic. So I don't go into it with real enthusiasm. So I tune halfway in. So again, it was Marissa. Marissa, your question helps me say or think that if I'm going to share this stuff, I want to know as much as I can know. You don't have to know everything, but sometimes you can share things and then say, hey, did you know that? Say, no, well, what does it mean to you? I'm just trying to get and listen to people. People say, hey, you know, my grandfather, my mother, my brother, I had an experience and so forth, and they may have just reason for feeling the way they do, but not for behaving the way they do. We get paid for the way we behave. And many times you can legislate behavior, but you can't legislate an attitude. But even if your attitude doesn't change, your behavior should. And if your behavior changes enough, eventually your attitude will change. That's what's going on with the police situation right now. I said defund the police. Whether you defund them or not, whoever is going to be police, they have to have an understanding that this is what I have a mandate to do, and this is what's going to happen to me if I don't perform within the context. I'm taking this job knowing what I'm getting into, and I'm saying this for with the police. You have a question now?
Amy mentioned that President Trump is stopping the anti-racism training for federal agencies. And I guess we've seen, people, even politicians, President Trump ignoring these reports. You mentioned President Johnson, when he mandated the Kerner Commission Report, also ignored evidence of systemic racism. How do we get people to buy into it?
Two parts. I was actually starting on it when I talked about the police, but number one, he can mandate training, or he can stop the training of that. First of all, that doesn't surprise me because that's who he is. But he has control of that right now. And another thing, I'll say it this way, because some people voted for him. I don't know who voted for him, but I'll say it this way. All my life, I've dealt with bullies. I know bullies. I know the psychology of a bully. I wasn't always 6'4". I was a little guy and wore glasses. So I got bullied a lot. I had to learn how to fight early, mainly not for myself, but by my glasses. So when you stop that kind of thing, number one, he's afraid of that. Number two, he is representing a group of people that says we shouldn't be getting involved in that at the federal level. Who let those people at the lower end deal with that. Don't spend our tax dollars teaching people about racism. But again, that's why I started with the doctrine that this is long-standing institutionalized thinking. Whether you see it, we haven't seen it from a president. But there are people at the presidential level, obviously, there have been people at the presidential level throughout history who thought like President Trump. They didn't act like President Trump. So one is, don't get overly alarmed about what President Trump says. And because he's out of pocket, that's what the folks on the street say. He's out of pocket. He believes he can do anything he wants to do. I'm not surprised at that. What we have to do is what you're doing now. President Trump doesn't control this. He doesn't control us sharing information with each other, trying to be as effective as we can in our delivery of a particular skill or set of skills to a particular group. And the other thing, Dwayne asked me what there's some things, some readings and all. I'm going to send you a list of things to read, not too many, but one of them, and some of you may have already looked at her videos or heard about a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. You should look at that. I'll send you one of the checklists out of there, and you take that checklist and look at it. But we're not going to get everything from the president. That's why local elections are so important. And even if he puts somebody on the Supreme Court, that's one thing. But you know what really drives our country in terms of law? At the state level, the state courts, they can't just undo anything that the state court says. That's why it's so hard. So we have to learn how to assess that situation and say, wow, okay, this is going to take a higher order, higher level of response, a higher order aggressive behavior. And we saw what happens in the psychosocial failure. It can happen on a lower level, it can happen on a higher level. Yes, Susan?
Yes. So Professor Linder, I really appreciated your story about your parents. There wasn't even a high school they could go to in Chester. So I feel place-based stories, and I've been, watching PBS documentaries over the years and stuff, and I learned about, I grew up outside of Detroit. My parents, my older brother and sister were born in Detroit, lived through the '67 uprising, whatever you want to call it. And but then I found out that when blacks started moving into the city to go into the factories, the city built a wall and said, black people live on this side of the wall and white people live on this side of the wall. And that's,
That's right.
brothers and sisters lifetime. And the other thing that was really sort of, most people probably know about redlining, where they said, you can't live in these neighborhoods, you can't live in these neighborhoods, real estate agents. And when I went looking for a house in the 90s, the real estate agent did not want to take me to the other side of the tracks in Lansdowne, where mostly black people live. And I said, I want to look at that house. I think this is baloney. Like I kind of went at the real estate agent, which isn't probably not the nicest thing to do, but these things are still there. And the one thing that I thought was interesting too, that I hadn't thought about, is when they came in and built the freeways, they were attacking urban blight, quote unquote. That was their federal funding for it. It happened in Detroit. I'm sure it happened in Philadelphia. They just raised neighborhoods with businesses, communities. They just tore them down so the highways could go.
Yes.
So to me, those real specific, like that happened, you can go to the place where it happened and point to it and find out what businesses were there before it happened.
Yes.
I don't know, to me, that obviously I get emotional. It's very moving, and the frustration and the anger.
Yes.
The whole cycle. So thank you for sharing that one story, and I think it's a story worth repeating. And if there were more stories specifically about Chester that we could share, I think it would be powerful for our students.
Yeah, I know we got to go, but in light of what you just said, one of the things that happened to me, I went to Widener, my undergraduate school was Widener. And my experience with Widener prior to me going there as a younger kid, when I was a young kid, we used to shine shoes. And so there was, before 95 was there, everything was even. They dug right down the middle of Chester and dug the hole to put 95 there. So they did exactly what you said, Susan, here. And that made two sides of town. We used to be able to walk up to Widener, and there was a bar where the Howard Johnson's is and all that stuff. And we used to shine shoes. So my experience prior to going to Widener was a shoe shine boy. And we shined the cadets' shoes, and the guys who went to that bar up there, they worked for the railroad, and it was a neighborhood bar, but we didn't live up there, but we went up to there to make money and shine shoes, and we left and came back down to our neighborhoods. And so finally they put 95 in, and they cut Widener off from the city. Then years later, I go there as a grown man, and I'm going to that institution, which they said, and I felt like I didn't belong there, but I got recruited there in the Act 101 program because they were putting black students in Widener. And first year and a half after, I did okay academically. I was about 3.0, but I didn't like it socially. A lot of cadets around me, and it was a paternalistic environment. And that means that they had people, generals and people from the military teaching classes, and they looked at us like we didn't belong there. They talked to us like we belong. Anyway, I dropped out. And I didn't go back till 2 years later. When I went back, then I understood why I was there in the first place. But it took me 2 years to get away from there, to get the courage. And when I say courage, I don't mean the capacity. Physically, I was a bad boy. I could handle myself in the hood. But the psychological courage to go back into Widener and complete that degree and decide that I was going to do something else with my life. I could have gone to North Dakota. I say that all the time. I could have gone to North Dakota, and the experience was so remote at Widener from where I lived on the other side of the tracks that I could have gone away to North Dakota, same experience. But I'm glad I went to Widener because it gave me a good understanding of what the world was about and what I was going to need to do to get over that. So you got a kid coming from Chester, parents may or may not have together 12 years of education. And so I got a master's degree from Kutztown, bachelor's degree from Widener, honorary doctorate degree for the books that I helped write and produce. And so I've been a professor and the mayor of the city. So which one of those theories is right? Is it the culture, or is it the ability for those institutions to be able to restrict people that produces the poverty and so forth? You know, so I mean, I don't usually I'm not tooting my horn. I'm just laying it out to you, just like you said, Susan. We have experiences, and to relate to what you're saying, your experience opened you up, and it is emotional, and that we see these things and we see these disparities, and we can't help from being emotional. But what we want to turn is your emotional experience into productive ways to relate, and you do that well. You work hard at it. At the I just happen to know you guys, some of you guys personally. I know you work hard at doing your best job and communicating with people and trying to get them to the best service they do. There's flaws everywhere. There's no perfect in this, but anyway, that was my experience, and you're right. Some of that behavior is intentional. So, but you know, there's other, like I said, workshops we can do to really dig deep into some of those areas and explain what they are and talk about strategies to combat them. Because if we don't practice, we ain't gonna win the game. we gotta practice the skills and ways to relate to each other.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Linder, for sharing such deep personal experiences with us, and for conducting the workshop for today. We definitely will look forward to seeing you again.
Anytime.
So thank you once again.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Nice meeting you all.